"That's a nice master bedroom," my father-in-law said as he stepped through the front door, slowly looking around my home like he was inspecting a property he already owned. My husband smiled beside him. "That one's yours, Dad." I thought he was joking. Then my mother-in-law pointed toward the upstairs hallway. "Our daughter can take the room across from yours." Before I could even process what I was hearing, my husband turned toward me and casually held out his hand. "Emma, go get Dad a set of keys." Everyone looked at me. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody asked whose house this really was. I stood up, smiled, and said one sentence. The color drained from my father-in-law's face before anyone else understood why. People often assume that serving in the U.S. Army teaches you how to survive danger. It does. But after 20 years in uniform, I learned that the deepest wounds rarely come from strangers. They come from the people sitting across your own dinner table. My name is Emma Walker. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent exactly half of my life wearing the same uniform. I have stood in deserts where the wind carried sand so fiercely it felt like tiny blades against my skin. I've slept in tents that rattled all night under relentless storms. I've missed birthdays, Christmas mornings, anniversaries, and funerals because duty came first. Like thousands of military families across America, I accepted those sacrifices because I believed they meant something bigger than myself. I never expected that the hardest battle of my life would begin inside the living room of the house my parents gave me. Not a battlefield. Not an overseas deployment. My own home. My parents weren't wealthy people. Far from it. My father spent 38 years repairing diesel engines for the county transportation department. His hands always smelled faintly of motor oil no matter how much he scrubbed them. My mother taught second grade in a public elementary school for nearly 4 decades. Every Christmas she bought gifts for children whose families couldn't afford them, even when it meant buying fewer presents for herself. Neither of them ever complained. They simply worked. Every single day. When I enlisted at 22, my father hugged me longer than he ever had before. "You'll always have a home," he whispered. At the time, I thought he meant his house. 20 years later, I finally understood what he really meant. A few months after I completed my 20th year of service, my parents invited me to lunch. I thought it was just another Sunday together. Instead, my father slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a single house key. I stared at it without speaking. My mother smiled through tears. "We wanted to give you something no deployment can take away." I honestly thought they were joking. Until Dad drove me 20 minutes across town. The house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't need to be. White siding, a wide front porch, a blue front door, a backyard large enough for summer barbecues and grandchildren my parents still hoped I might have someday. It was beautiful. It felt peaceful. It felt permanent. I cried harder that afternoon than I had after any promotion I'd ever received. My parents had quietly spent years saving for that house. Years. My father later admitted they skipped vacations, delayed replacing their old pickup truck, and refinanced their own mortgage just to make it happen. "You spent your life protecting everyone else," Mom told me. "Now it's time someone gave you a place where nobody could take care of everyone except you." Those words stayed with me. The deed was placed solely in my name. At the closing, the attorney explained every document carefully. I barely listened. Not because I wasn't paying attention. Because I couldn't stop looking at my parents. I kept wondering how many sacrifices were hidden behind their smiles. When I married David 6 years earlier, he seemed genuinely happy for me. He had always described himself as someone who admired military service, even though he'd never served himself. He was funny, easygoing, patient. At least that's what I believed. When I told him my parents had bought the house, he wrapped me in a hug. "They deserve a daughter like you." It sounded sincere. Later, when I mentioned that the deed listed only my name, he laughed. "That's just paperwork." I laughed too. After all, marriage wasn't supposed to be about paperwork. It was supposed to be about trust. Over the years, I noticed little things that seemed too small to worry about. David often joked that one day his parents would probably move in with us because their own house was getting too much to handle. I'd smile politely. He'd say it was just a joke. Sometimes his mother would comment on how spacious my backyard was. What a wonderful place for family gatherings. Again, harmless. At least that's what I thought. Looking back now, I realized there were warning signs everywhere. I simply chose not to connect them. Military life teaches you to evaluate threats. Marriage teaches you to ignore some of them. I wish I had trusted my instincts instead. When David told me his parents wanted to come over for dinner and finally see the house, I was genuinely excited. His father, Richard, had always been polite to me. Reserved. Old-fashioned. He rarely showed emotion, but I believed he respected my career. His mother, Linda, loved talking about recipes, gardening, and church events. She could be overbearing, but nothing unusual. I spent nearly 2 days preparing for their visit. I grilled steaks exactly the way Richard liked them. I baked Linda's favorite peach cobbler using the recipe she'd once written down for me. Fresh flowers sat in the dining room. The silverware my mother had given me was polished until it gleamed. Everything felt warm, welcoming, like the beginning of a wonderful family memory. Around 5 o'clock, I looked out the front window and saw David's parents pulling into the driveway. David hurried outside before I even reached the door. His excitement surprised me. He looked almost anxious. Richard climbed out of the passenger seat, slowly adjusted his jacket, and stood quietly for a moment. Instead of looking at me, he looked at the house. Long, carefully. His eyes traveled from the roofline to the porch columns, then to every window, almost as if he were evaluating resale value. He stepped inside without saying much. His fingertips brushed lightly against the kitchen island. He measured the living room with his eyes. He glanced toward the staircase, then toward the backyard through the glass doors. He nodded once. Finally, he looked at David instead of me. "This is bigger than I expected." David smiled. "I told you you'd love it." I remember standing there with a serving tray in my hands, forcing myself to ignore the strange feeling growing in my stomach. Something about the way they looked at each other felt rehearsed. Almost like they were continuing a conversation that had started long before I walked into the room. Then Richard slowly pointed toward the staircase. "So," he said calmly, "show me the upstairs." He didn't ask if he could. He simply started walking. And David immediately followed him. David followed his father upstairs without waiting for me. I set the serving tray on the kitchen island and wiped my hands on a dish towel, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. Maybe Richard was simply curious. After all, anyone visiting a new home would naturally want a tour. That was what I kept telling myself. When I reached the second floor, Richard was already standing in the doorway of the primary bedroom with his hands folded behind his back. He slowly turned in a full circle, studying every detail. The afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, catching the soft gray walls my mother had helped me paint only a few months earlier. He nodded with quiet approval. "This room gets excellent morning light." "It does," I answered with a smile. "My mom picked the colors." He barely acknowledged my response. Instead, he looked at David. "This bed fits nicely." David grinned. "I knew you'd like it." The comment landed strangely in my ears. "You'd like it. Not Emma likes it. Not, isn't this a beautiful room? You'd like it." I brushed the thought aside before it could grow into something larger. Richard stepped into the walk-in closet. Plenty of storage. Then into the bathroom. Large shower. Then back into the bedroom. He wasn't admiring the home. He was evaluating it. Room by room. Feature by feature. I caught David watching his father's reactions with the eager expression of a son hoping to earn approval. That expression wasn't new. Throughout our marriage, David had always wanted his parents' praise. If his father complimented a steak, David talked about it for days. If his mother admired a piece of furniture, David immediately wanted to buy something similar. I had always thought it was harmless. Standing there, I wasn't so sure anymore. We continued down the hallway. Richard opened every bedroom door. "This one's a good size. So is this one. Nice view from this window." He asked David questions about the insulation, the heating system, the roof, and even the age of the water heater. Not once did he ask me. Not once. It was as though I were simply another guest following behind them. When we finally returned downstairs, Linda was arranging plates on the dining table. "Oh, this kitchen is wonderful," she said. "Family holidays will be so much easier here." I smiled politely. "I hope everyone enjoys coming over." She looked around the room. "Oh, they certainly will." There was something about the way she emphasized will that lingered in my mind. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Richard complimented the steak. Linda asked about one of my former deployments overseas. David filled everyone's glasses with iced tea. For nearly half an hour, everything felt almost normal. Then the conversation shifted. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Our house has become a lot to maintain." David nodded immediately. "I've been telling Emma that." I looked at him. "You have?" He smiled without looking at me. "You know, just mentioning it here and there." I didn't remember a single serious conversation about it. Richard continued. "The stairs are getting harder on your mother." Linda sighed dramatically. "I nearly slipped last month." I felt genuine concern. "Are you okay?" "Oh, I'm fine," she answered. "But we can't stay there forever." David reached across the table and gently patted his mother's hand. "You won't have to." Again I looked at him. There it was. Another sentence that seemed to have started before I entered the conversation. Richard gave a satisfied nod but quickly changed the subject, asking about my latest assignment. The rest of dinner passed with polite conversation, yet something inside me refused to settle. Years in the army had taught me to trust patterns more than words. People could lie. Patterns rarely did. Every strange glance between David and his parents, every unfinished sentence, every assumption. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a picture I couldn't quite see yet. After dessert, Linda wandered into the backyard. "Oh, Emma," she called, "come look at these flower beds." I joined her outside. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass. She smiled sweetly. "You've built such a lovely life." "Thank you." "You've been blessed?" "I have." She slipped her arm through mine. "You know, and families should stay together as they get older." I nodded. "I agree." She squeezed my arm. "Especially when there's plenty of room." Before I could respond, David called us back inside. As we walked toward the house, I glanced through the large kitchen window. Richard and David were standing alone in the living room. They stopped talking the instant they saw me. Both smiled. Too quickly. That uneasy feeling returned. Not fear. Not yet. Just the quiet instinct that had kept me alive more than once during my military career. Something wasn't right. I simply didn't know what. And by the time I finally understood, it would already be too late. David's hand remained stretched toward me. "The keys, Emma." The room fell quiet. Not the comfortable silence that follows a good meal, but the kind that presses against your ears until every heartbeat sounds louder than it should. Linda folded her hands together and smiled expectantly. Richard stood beside the fireplace with the confidence of a man who believed the evening had already gone exactly as planned. David looked at me with mild impatience, as though I were holding everyone up over something trivial. I looked around my own living room. The framed photograph of my parents on the mantel. The quilt my mother had sewn by hand draped across the sofa. The oak coffee table my father had spent 3 weekends building after work because he said, "Store-bought furniture never tells a story." Every corner of that house carried a memory. Every piece had been chosen with love. Not once had anyone sitting in that room asked how I felt about what was happening. I slowly stood. Years in the army teach you that calm is often louder than anger. You don't raise your voice. You steady it. You don't rush. You let everyone else reveal themselves first. I smiled. "I'd be happy to." David's shoulders relaxed immediately. "I knew you'd understand." I held his gaze. "Just as soon as the owners agree." His smile disappeared. "What?" "I said I'd be happy to hand over the keys as soon as the owners agree." Linda frowned. "But you are the owner." I gently shook my head. "Not exactly." Richard's eyes narrowed for the first time that evening. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, and unlocked it. David gave a short laugh. "Emma, what are you doing?" "I'm calling the other owners." He frowned. "There aren't any other owners." I didn't answer. Instead, I tapped a familiar name. Mom. The FaceTime call rang only once. My mother's smiling face appeared on the screen almost immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." Behind her, I could see my father sitting in his favorite recliner with a newspaper folded on his lap. "Everything okay?" he asked. "It is now," I replied. I switched the camera so everyone in the room could be seen. "Mom, Dad, I have a question." "Of course." "Could you tell everyone who owns this house?" Neither of them hesitated. My father answered first. "You do." Then he added quietly, "And your mother and I retained our protective life interest rights just as the attorney recommended." Silence. Complete silence. David blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" My father continued calmly. "When we bought the property, we followed our attorney's advice. Emma is the legal owner, but certain protective provisions remain in place. The house can't be transferred, pledged, refinanced, or occupied by additional permanent residents without the written consent of all protected parties." Linda looked confused. "I don't understand." My mother smiled kindly. "We've seen too many military families lose everything because they trusted the wrong people. We wanted to make sure Emma would always have a home." David stared at the phone. "Nobody ever told me that." Dad answered before I could. "You never asked." The words landed with surprising weight. Richard hadn't spoken. Not once. I looked toward him. His face had changed. Only minutes earlier he had carried himself with quiet confidence. Now the color had drained from his cheeks. His jaw tightened. His eyes shifted from me to David, then back to the phone. I suddenly remembered something David had once mentioned years ago. His father had worked in commercial real estate before retiring. Richard understood property law. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to know exactly what my father meant. Enough to realize that everything they had assumed about this evening had just collapsed. David looked between us. "Dad!" Richard didn't answer. "Dad, Finally, Richard spoke. What exactly are those protections? My father explained patiently. If Emma is ever pressured into transferring the property, if there's a marital dispute involving ownership, or if someone attempts to occupy the home against her wishes, those provisions become immediately enforceable. David laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. No, my father replied. It's called planning. Linda looked at me. You mean we couldn't simply move in? I answered quietly. No, David stepped closer. Emma, why didn't you ever mention any of this? I met his eyes. Because you always said the paperwork didn't matter. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I remembered that conversation perfectly. It's just paperwork. I had believed those words because I believed my husband. Now those same words had returned like a boomerang. Richard slowly lowered himself into an armchair. For the first time all evening he looked old. Not weak, not frail, just deeply tired. He rubbed one hand across his forehead. David turned toward him again. Dad, say something. Richard remained silent for several long seconds. Then he looked directly at his son. Did you know about this? David hesitated. No. Did you ever ask whose name was on every document? No. Did you ever ask whether Emma's parents had protected their investment? No. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I could almost see the realization settling over him. This wasn't merely an awkward misunderstanding. His son had built an entire plan on assumptions instead of conversations. David looked at me desperately. This doesn't change anything. It changes everything, I replied. No, we're family. Family asks. He shook his head. I was going to tell you. When? No answer. After everyone moved in, still nothing. My father finally spoke again through the phone. Emma. Yes, Dad? You don't owe anyone your home simply because you're kind. I swallowed hard. Those words reached somewhere deep inside me. For 20 years I'd led soldiers. I'd made difficult decisions under impossible conditions. Yet somehow inside my own marriage I'd mistaken silence for peace. Richard slowly stood. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. David. His son looked relieved. Yeah. Richard's expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. Don't touch another thing. The room froze. David stared at his father in disbelief. What? Richard didn't repeat himself. He simply looked around the house once more, not like a man admiring a future home, but like someone realizing he'd been walking through a place where he had never been invited. No one spoke after Richard's warning. The silence settled over the room like heavy fog swallowing every sound except the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking clock my mother had insisted belonged above the fireplace. David looked from his father to me, searching for someone to break the tension. No one did. I thanked my parents for answering my call, promised I'd speak with them later, and ended the FaceTime conversation. The screen went black. The room somehow felt even quieter. I placed my phone on the coffee table and took a slow breath. For years, the Army had trained me to separate emotion from facts. When reports conflicted, you didn't argue. You gathered evidence. You laid everything on the table. Tonight would be no different. I said calmly, it's time we stopped pretending this evening is about showing your parents my house. David folded his arms. What does that mean? It means this visit wasn't spontaneous. His eyebrows rose. Emma, you're overthinking this. I almost smiled. I had heard those words before. During briefings, whenever someone ignored warning signs, there was always a voice in the room insisting everyone was overthinking. That attitude had gotten people hurt. I wasn't about to let it happen in my own life. I walked to the study just off the living room. When I returned, I carried my laptop. David's expression changed ever so slightly. What are you doing? I want to answer a question that's been bothering me. What question? How long this has been planned. I opened the laptop and entered my password. For a moment, no one moved. Then my inbox appeared. I clicked a folder. David's face lost a little more color. The folder wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It was simply labeled home. Months earlier, while organizing household paperwork, I'd synchronized several shared files that David had asked me to back up. At the time, I hadn't looked closely. After tonight's conversation upstairs, something had pushed me to check them before dinner was over. What I found had changed everything. I turned the screen so everyone could see. This email was sent 8 months ago. Richard leaned forward. Linda adjusted her glasses. David remained perfectly still. I read aloud. Dad, I measured the upstairs today. The primary bedroom should fit your furniture without any problem. The room fell silent again. I clicked the next message. Mom, you'll love the kitchen. Once Emma gets used to the idea, it'll feel like home for everyone. Then another. I'm thinking my sister can have the guest room on the east side. Another. We'll probably convert Emma's office into a playroom for the kids. Another. No need to rush. She hates conflict. Once we're all moved in, she'll eventually accept it. My voice never changed. I simply read the words exactly as they had been written. No dramatics. No accusations. Facts. Pure undeniable facts. Linda covered her mouth. Richard slowly turned toward his son. David looked like a man trying to remember how to breathe. Emma. I raised one hand gently. I'm not finished. I opened another folder. Floor plans. Furniture layouts. A moving checklist. Estimated dates for selling Richard and Linda's house. A spreadsheet labeled moving budget. Even paint samples for what they intended to call Dad's room. My bedroom. The room my parents had dreamed of giving me. The room where I'd finally slept peacefully after years of deployments. Richard stared at the screen. I've never seen these, David swallowed. I was just making plans. You made decisions, I corrected quietly. There's a difference. He looked at me desperately. I wasn't hiding anything. I looked around the room. Really? He hesitated. No, you weren't. No, I mean, his words collapsed under their own weight. Richard spoke for the first time in several minutes. When were you planning to tell Emma? David rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know. You don't know. I thought. He stopped. What did you think? Richard asked. I thought once everyone was here, she'd see how happy it made everyone. I felt something inside me sink. Not because I hadn't expected that answer. Because I finally understood it. He hadn't forgotten to ask me. He had never intended to. In his mind, my agreement wasn't necessary. It was inevitable. I closed the laptop. The sound echoed through the room. David, I asked softly, were you ever going to ask whether I wanted 6 more people living here? He looked down. I didn't ask what you figured. Silence. I asked whether you were ever going to ask. His shoulders sagged. No. The honesty hit harder than another excuse ever could have. Linda began quietly crying. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought Emma had already agreed. I believed her. Looking back over the messages, I realized something. Most of them had been between David and his father. Linda had been copied occasionally, but rarely involved in the planning. Richard remained motionless. His eyes stayed fixed on his son. Then he asked a question that surprised all of us. Did you tell your mother we'd already discussed this with Emma? David didn't answer. Richard's voice hardened. Did you? Yes. Linda looked at her son in disbelief. You told me Emma wanted us here. David couldn't meet her eyes. I thought she would. Richard stood slowly. He had carried himself all evening with quiet confidence, the confidence of a father expecting to move into his son's home. Now he looked like a man carrying something much heavier. Disappointment. Not in me. In his own son. When I raised you, Richard said quietly, I taught you that a man's word matters. David stared at the floor. I know. No? Richard shook his head. You don't. His voice never rose. That somehow made it more powerful. You don't build a future by taking someone else's choices away. No one interrupted him. You ask. He looked around my living room. You respect what isn't yours. Then he looked directly at David. And until someone freely offers it, he paused. It never becomes yours. I felt tears gathering, but I refused to let them fall. Not because I was trying to appear strong. Because Richard had just said aloud the truth I'd been struggling to explain to myself all evening. This had never been about square footage, or bedrooms, or keys. It was about respect. Somewhere along the way, my husband had stopped seeing me as an equal partner. Without realizing it, he'd begun making decisions for me instead of with me. That realization hurt far more than any plan to move his parents into the house. After 2 decades in uniform, I'd trusted people with my life. The Army had taught me something simple. Trust isn't measured by what people say when everything is easy. It's measured by what they do when they believe you'll never find out. I looked at David one last time. I spent 20 years serving this country. He nodded weakly. I know. I've been deployed to places where I depended on complete strangers to protect my back. I know. And somehow, my voice remained calm. I felt safer with them than I do standing in my own living room tonight. The words hung in the air. Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with sadness. He looked at his son for a long moment before quietly asking the question that changed the direction of the evening. David, his voice cracked just slightly. What have you done? Richard's question lingered in the room. David, what have you done? No one answered. David looked at his father, then at me as if hoping one of us would rescue him from the silence he'd created. His shoulders, which had been so confident only an hour earlier now, seemed to collapse under the weight of his own decisions. Finally he spoke. I messed up. It wasn't enough. Not because I wanted punishment. because those 3 words didn't begin to describe what had happened. I had spent years believing we were building a life together. Tonight I learned that while I was planning a future with my husband, he had been planning one for me. "They're my parents," David said quietly. "I just wanted to take care of them." I nodded. "I know. I never wanted to hurt you." "I believe that too." His eyes lifted with a flicker of hope. "But hurting me wasn't the problem," I continued. "Deciding for me was." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. Richard remained standing near the fireplace. "I've known your mother for 45 years, he said without looking away from David. "Do you know how many major decisions I've ever made without asking her first?" David slowly shook his head. "None." Richard's voice stayed calm. "Not where we lived. Not what house we bought. Not when I retired. Not when we helped you through college." He paused. "Marriage isn't leadership." His eyes shifted toward me. "It's partnership." Linda quietly wiped away another tear. "I honestly thought Emma had invited us." I walked over and gently touched her hand. "I know." She looked at me with genuine regret. "I'm so sorry." For the first time that evening, I believed every word she said. Then David stepped closer. "Emma, we can fix this." I looked at him. "Can we? We'll start over." "What does starting over mean?" "I'll tell them they can't move in." "You mean you'll cancel a plan you never asked me about?" His face fell. "That's not what I meant." "I know." I took a slow breath. "My entire career has been built on trust." He nodded. "I know. When soldiers trusted my decisions, they weren't trusting my rank. They were trusting my judgment." I looked around the living room. "The same is true in marriage." No one interrupted. "You didn't lose my trust tonight because you wanted to help your parents." I let those words settle before continuing. "You lost it because you assumed my voice wasn't necessary." David covered his face with both hands. "I never thought about it that way." "I know. And that's exactly why we're here." The room became still again. Outside evening had settled over the neighborhood. The porch light reflected softly against the front windows. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while riding bicycles. Life continued. Just not the life I thought I had. Richard finally walked toward his son. Without raising his voice, he held out one hand. "The keys." David looked confused. "What?" "The house keys." "They're in my pocket." "I know." David slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare set I'd given him years earlier. Richard extended his hand again. "Give them to me." David hesitated only a second before placing them in his father's palm. Richard walked across the room and stopped in front of me. He placed the keys in my hand and gently closed my fingers around them. "They belong with you." I swallowed hard. "Thank you." Then Richard turned toward his wife. "Linda." She stood immediately. "We're leaving." She nodded. Neither of them argued. Neither of them asked for another chance to explain. As Richard reached the front door, he stopped and looked back at me. "Emma." "Yes, I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I do." His voice carried the quiet dignity of a man unwilling to hide behind excuses. "I should have asked before I ever walked upstairs." I shook my head. "You trusted your son." "I did." "And I was wrong." He looked toward David. "I thought I raised a man who understood respect." Then he looked back at me. "Your parents raised a remarkable daughter." His eyes glistened for just a moment. "I only wish I'd raised a better son." The front door closed softly behind them. David and I stood alone. For several minutes, neither of us moved. Finally, he spoke. "Are you leaving me?" I stared at the family photograph on the mantel. It had been taken 3 years earlier. We were smiling, laughing, looking like two people who shared the same dreams. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Weeks passed. We tried counseling. We had difficult conversations that should have happened years earlier. David apologized more times than I could count. He admitted he had always struggled to say no to his parents. He admitted he'd convinced himself that I would eventually agree because I'd always been patient. He admitted that he had mistaken my kindness for permission. Those conversations mattered, but they couldn't erase what had already been revealed. Trust, I learned, isn't rebuilt with apologies alone. It's rebuilt one choice at a time. Sometimes by the time someone is ready to make those choices, the other person has already accepted that the foundation is gone. 3 months later, I signed the divorce papers. There was no shouting, no courtroom drama, no revenge. Just 2 signatures. 2 people acknowledging that respect had quietly disappeared long before either of us admitted it. A few weeks after the divorce became final, my parents came over for Sunday dinner. Dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard. Mom insisted on bringing far too much potato salad, just as she always had. We ate on the back patio while the sun slowly disappeared behind the maple trees. At one point, Dad looked around the yard and smiled. Feels peaceful. It does. He looked at me carefully. Any regrets? I thought about that for a long moment. I regret believing that avoiding conflict would protect my marriage. He nodded. What did it do instead? It delayed the truth. He smiled sadly. Sometimes that's the hardest lesson. I still live in that house today. Not because it's valuable, not because it's beautiful, but because every wall reminds me of something my parents gave me that was far more important than a roof over my head. They gave me security. They gave me independence. Most of all, they taught me that love never demands your silence to prove your loyalty. If someone truly loves you, they'll ask before they assume. They'll listen before they decide. And they'll never mistake your kindness for surrender. If my story reminded you of someone in your own life, or if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you would have done in my place. And if stories like this speak to you, please subscribe and join us. We have many more heartfelt stories to share, and I'd be honored to have you along for the journey.